Tonight we drift back to the dawn before memory, to a world where chaos became cosmos, where mountains walked and gods breathed destiny into the wind. Close your eyes. Let your thoughts slow. Let the night carry you. This is the story of Greek mythology, from the birth of the first beings to the fall of heroes and empires. A tale whispered for millennia, but tonight it is told for you, gently, calmly, so you may listen or fall asleep. If you enjoy journeys like this, consider liking the video. It helps more dreamers find their way here. And tell us where you're listening from. The world is vast and it's beautiful to see where these stories reach. Now, settle in. The fire is warm, the night is long, and the gods are waiting. Before there were gods, before there were mortals, before there was even earth or sky, there was chaos. Not chaos as we think of it today, disorder and confusion, but rather a vast yawning void, an emptiness, the primordial state of existence. From this chaos, the first beings emerged spontaneously, without parents, without creation in any traditional sense. They simply came into being because existence demanded it. First came Gaia, the earth herself, not a goddess standing on the earth, but the earth itself given consciousness and form. She was the foundation of all that would follow, solid and eternal. Then came Tartarus, the deep abyss beneath the earth, a place so far below the surface that an anvil dropped from earth would take 9 days to reach it. Tartarus was both a being and a place, a prison that would later hold the most terrible enemies of the gods. Next emerged Eros, the primordial force of love and desire, not the chubby cherub of later traditions, but a fundamental cosmic power that would drive all creation forward. Without Eros, nothing would join with anything else. There would be no generation, no creation, no continuation of existence. Erebus, the darkness, and Nyx, the night, also came forth from chaos. These two beings represented the absence of light, the mystery and terror of the unknown. Now, here's where it gets interesting. These primordial beings began to reproduce. Nyx, the night, gave birth to a host of abstract concepts made flesh. She birthed Thanatos, death itself. She birthed Hypnos, sleep. The Moirai, the three fates who control every mortal life, were her daughters. Nemesis, divine retribution, came from her. Eris, strife and discord, was her child. Even Gera's old age emerged from the night. Think about what this means. The Greeks weren't just telling stories, they were explaining how the fundamental forces of existence came to be. Death, sleep, fate, these aren't just things that happen, they're beings, entities with their own consciousness and will. Meanwhile, Gaia, the earth, was not idle. She gave birth to Uranos, the sky, making him equal to herself in grandeur so that he could cover her completely and be a home for the gods. She also created the mountains and Pontus, the primordial sea. Gaia and Uranos, earth and sky, came together as the first divine couple, and from their union came the Titans, 12 powerful deities who would rule the cosmos before the Olympians. The Titans were Oceanus, the great world-encircling river, Coeus and Creus, about whom little is remembered, Hyperion, the light, Iapetus, who would father some of the most important figures in mythology, Theia, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe and Tethys, the female Titans, each embodying fundamental aspects of reality. And then there was Cronus, the youngest, who would change everything. But Uranus and Gaia's children weren't limited to the Titans. They also bore the Cyclopes, 3 giant beings, each with a single eye in the centre of their forehead. Their names were Brontes, Sterops and Arges, thunder, lightning, and brightness. These beings would later forge Zeus's thunderbolts, and there were the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers named Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges. Each had 50 heads and 100 arms, beings of unimaginable power and terrible to behold. Here's where the first great conflict of Greek mythology begins. Uranos looked upon the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires and was horrified. These children were too monstrous, too powerful, too threatening to his rule. So he did something unthinkable. He seized them and hurled them down into Tartarus, imprisoning them in the deepest pit of existence. Gaia was furious. These were her children, and Uranos had cast them into eternal darkness simply because he feared them. The pain of having her children ripped from her and imprisoned was unbearable. She groaned with anguish and began to plot revenge. From within herself, from her own substance, Gaia created a great sickle made of adamant, the hardest substance in existence. She called together her Titan children and made them a proposal. One of them must castrate Uranus, their father, to end his reign and his tyranny. The Titans were terrified. This was their father she was asking them to mutilate. All of them recoiled from the task, all except Cronus, the youngest. Cronus, whose name may mean time itself, agreed to do the terrible deed. Gaia gave him the adamantine sickle and instructed him. That night, when Uranus came to lie with Gaia, spreading himself over her as the sky covers the earth, Cronus was waiting. He reached out with the sickle and in one swift motion castrated his father. The blood of Uranus spilled upon Gaia, and from these drops came more beings. The Gigantes, a race of giants who would later war against the Olympian gods, sprang from this blood. The Erinyes, the Furies, 3 goddesses of vengeance named Alecto, Megaera and Tisiphone, emerged to punish those who committed crimes, especially those who killed their own family members. And the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs, also came into being. But something else happened too. Cronus threw his father's severed genitals into the sea. They fell into the foam and waves, and from that foam something miraculous occurred. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, was born, emerging fully grown from the sea foam, the most beautiful being ever to exist, stepping onto the shores of Cyprus. Uranus, wounded and humiliated, retreated to the upper heavens, never again to come so close to Earth. His reign was over. The age of the Titans had begun. But as Uranus withdrew, he pronounced a curse on Cronus. You have done this to your father, and someday your own children will do the same to you. With Uranus deposed, Cronus became the ruler of the cosmos. He took his sister Rhea as his wife, and together they presided over what would later be remembered as the Golden Age. This was a time of peace and prosperity. Mortals lived like gods, free from toil, grief, and suffering. The earth gave forth its bounty freely without the need for agriculture. There was no war, no violence, no greed. When humans died, they simply fell asleep and became benevolent spirits watching over later generations. Cronus freed his Titan siblings from wherever Uranus had confined them, and together they ruled. Oceanus and Tethys governed the waters and produced the 3,000 river gods and 3,000 ocean nymphs. Hyperion and Thea gave birth to Helios the sun, Selene the moon, and Eos the dawn. Coeus and Phoebe had Leto and Asteria. Iapetus fathered Atlas, Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Menoetius, figures who would play crucial roles in the relationship between gods and mortals. But Cronus could not forget his father's curse. The prophecy haunted him. One of his own children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown Uranus. He became paranoid, obsessed with preventing this fate. When Rhea gave birth to their first child, Hestia, Cronus demanded to see the baby. Rhea, proud and loving, brought the newborn to her husband, and Cronus, without hesitation, swallowed the child whole. Rhea was horrified, but what could she do? Cronus was the king of the cosmos, the most powerful being in existence. When she gave birth to their second child, Demeter, the same thing happened. Cronus swallowed her. Then came Hera, their third child, swallowed. Then Hades, their fourth child, swallowed. Then Poseidon, their fifth, swallowed as well. 5 times Rhea had experienced the joy of childbirth, and 5 times she had watched her husband consume their child to prevent the prophecy. The children weren't dead. Gods cannot die. But they were trapped inside Cronus, held in darkness, unable to grow or be free. When Rhea became pregnant for the 6th time, she could not bear to lose another child. She went to her parents, Gaia and Uranus, and begged for their help. They advised her to go to Crete, to give birth in a secret cave on Mount Ida. There, Rhea delivered her 6th child, a son she named Zeus. She hid the baby in the cave where he was raised by the nymph Amalthea, who fed him on goat's milk and honey. The Curetes, warrior dancers, clashed their spears against their shields whenever the baby cried, drowning out the sound so Cronus wouldn't hear. But Cronus demanded to see the newborn. Rhea was ready. She wrapped a large stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to her husband. Without even looking closely, Cronus grabbed the bundle and swallowed it whole. Believing he had consumed his sixth child and prevented the prophecy once more, Zeus grew up in secret on Crete, nursed by Amalthea and protected by the Curetes. He grew quickly, as gods do, becoming stronger and wiser with each passing day. The nymph Metis, whose name means cunning intelligence, became his advisor and first love. When Zeus had grown to full strength, Metis helped him devise a plan. She prepared a special potion, a powerful emetic, and together they found a way to get it to Cronus. Different versions of the myth tell this differently. Some say Zeus disguised himself as a cupbearer, others say Metis herself delivered it. But the result was the same. Cronus drank the potion, and immediately his stomach revolted. He began to vomit. First came the stone that Rhea had given him in place of Zeus. This stone was later set up at Delphi as a sacred monument. Then came Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, and finally Hestia, eldest of them all. The 5 siblings emerged fully grown from their father's stomach. They had been conscious all that time, trapped in darkness, and they were furious. They immediately rallied to Zeus's side. Cronus was enraged. The prophecy was coming true. His children were rebelling against him, but he was still powerful, and he had the other Titans on his side. A great war was inevitable. This was the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, and it would last for 10 brutal years. Zeus and his siblings made Mount Olympus their stronghold. Zeus became their leader, not because he was the eldest, he was actually the youngest, but because he had freed them, and because he possessed both strength and cunning. Hestia, gentle goddess of the hearth, took no part in the fighting, but Hera, Demeter, Hades and Poseidon all became warriors in this cosmic war. The Titans, led by Cronus, fought from Mount Othrys. Most of the Titans sided with Cronus. He was their brother, their king, and they had prospered under his rule. But some Titans chose different paths. Oceanus remained neutral, staying in his realm encircling the world. Themis, goddess of divine law, and her daughter Prometheus, the forward-thinking Titan, sided with Zeus, recognizing that change was necessary and that Zeus would bring a new order. For 10 years the battle raged. The earth shook with the combat. Mountains were torn apart and hurled as weapons. The seas boiled. Fire rained from the sky. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Then Zeus remembered the Cyclops and the Hecatonchires, still imprisoned in Tartarus where Uranos had cast them so long ago. He descended into the underworld and found them still bound. He killed their guard, Campe, a terrible dragon woman, and freed them. The Cyclops were grateful beyond measure. They had been imprisoned for eons, and Zeus had given them freedom. To repay him, they forged weapons of unimaginable power. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt. Not just lightning, but a weapon that could shatter mountains and strike with the force of divine will. For Poseidon, they forged the trident, a 3-pronged spear that could shake the earth and command the seas. For Hades, they crafted a helm of invisibility, allowing him to move unseen. The Hecatonchires too pledged their loyalty to Zeus. With their 100 hands each, they could hurl 300 boulders at once, raining devastation on their enemies. With these new allies and weapons, the tide of the war turned. Zeus wielded his thunderbolts, striking down Titans with heavenly fire. The Hecatonchires buried the enemy beneath avalanches of stone. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, causing earthquakes that shattered the Titans' fortifications. One by one, the Titans fell. Some were struck down by thunderbolts. Others were overwhelmed by the Hecatonchires' assault. Cronus himself, the king who had ruled for an age, was defeated by his own son. The Olympians were victorious, but what to do with the defeated Titans? They could not be killed. Gods are immortal. So Zeus had them bound in chains forged by the Cyclops and hurled them down into Tartarus, into that terrible abyss far beneath the earth. The Hecatonchires became their jailers, standing eternal guard to ensure they would never escape. Not all the Titans were imprisoned. Those who had sided with Zeus or remained neutral were allowed to keep their positions. Oceanus still encircles the world. Themis became Zeus's advisor, and Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus were spared, though their story would later take a tragic turn. The war was over. The Titans' reign had ended. The age of the Olympians had begun. With the Titanomachy won, Zeus and his siblings had to establish their new order. But even among the victors, there were questions about who would rule what. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades drew lots to divide the cosmos. Zeus won the sky and became king of the gods. Poseidon won the seas, becoming lord of all waters. Hades won the underworld, becoming king of the dead and the vast wealth hidden beneath the earth. The earth itself and Mount Olympus were to be shared by all. The three brothers agreed to this division, though tensions would sometimes arise. Hades in particular felt somewhat slighted. The underworld was a dark, lonely realm, and he would be separated from the other gods on Olympus. Zeus established his court on Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in Greece. This would be the home of the gods, a paradise above the clouds where they would feast on ambrosia and nectar, debate, scheme, and occasionally descend to meddle in mortal affairs. The Olympians gradually grew in number. Zeus's original siblings formed the core: Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home; Demeter, goddess of agriculture and the harvest; Hera, who would become Zeus's wife and queen of the gods; Poseidon, god of the seas, and Hades, god of the underworld. But Zeus was remarkably prolific, and many more Olympians were his children. Some were born from his wife Hera, others from his many affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortals. Let's talk about these affairs because they're crucial to Greek mythology. Zeus, despite being married to Hera, had countless romantic entanglements. This wasn't just philandering. Each affair had cosmic significance, producing gods, goddesses, and heroes who would shape the world. One of Zeus's first relationships was with Metis, the Titaness of wisdom who had helped him defeat Cronus. She became pregnant, but Zeus learned of a prophecy. Metis would bear 2 children, first a daughter, then a son, and that son would be more powerful than Zeus and would overthrow him. Zeus remembered what had happened to his father and grandfather. He wasn't going to let history repeat itself, so he did something drastic. He swallowed Metis whole while she was still pregnant. Time passed, and Zeus began to suffer terrible headaches. The pain grew worse and worse until he couldn't bear it. He called for Hephaestus, the craftsman god, and ordered him to split open his head with an axe. Hephaestus did so, and from Zeus's head sprang Athena, fully grown and fully armoured, shouting a war cry. She would become goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and craft, one of the most important Olympians, born from Zeus alone, combining the cunning of her mother Metis with the power of her father Zeus. Zeus also had a relationship with Leto, a Titaness, who became pregnant with twins. But Hera, Zeus's wife, was insanely jealous. She persecuted Leto, forbidding any land from giving her a place to give birth. Leto wandered the world in agony, in labour but unable to deliver her children. Finally, she came to Delos, a floating island that wasn't technically land, and there she gave birth to Apollo and Artemis, twin gods who would become among the most important deities in the Greek pantheon. Apollo became god of music, poetry, prophecy, and the sun, while Artemis became goddess of the hunt, wilderness, and the moon. Zeus had a relationship with Maia, one of the Pleiades, and she bore Hermes, the swift-footed messenger god, god of travellers, thieves, and commerce. He seduced Semele, a mortal princess who became pregnant with Dionysus. But Hera, in her jealousy, tricked Semele into asking Zeus to reveal himself in his true divine form. Zeus tried to refuse, knowing it would kill her, but he had sworn an unbreakable oath. When he appeared in his true form, the divine radiance incinerated Semele. Zeus managed to save the unborn Dionysus by sewing the fetus into his own thigh, from which the god was later born. Dionysus would become god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre. With Hera, his wife and sister, Zeus had several children. Ares, god of war, not the strategic war of Athena, but the bloodlust and violence of battle. Hebe, goddess of youth. Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth. And Hephaestus, the divine craftsman and smith, though some versions say Hera bore him alone in retaliation for Zeus's affair with Metis. The Olympian pantheon grew to include 12 major gods, though which 12 varied depending on the tradition. The most common list includes Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Hermes, and either Hestia or Dionysus. Hades, though powerful, was not counted among the Olympians because he dwelt in the underworld rather than on Olympus. Each god had their own domain, their own sphere of influence. They represented different aspects of life and nature, and they were deeply, profoundly human in their emotions. They felt jealousy, rage, love, desire, pride, and pettiness. The Greek gods were not paragons of moral virtue. They were powerful, immortal beings with all the flaws and passions of humans, amplified to cosmic scale. The Olympians might have thought their struggles were over after defeating the Titans. They were wrong. Remember that blood of Uranos that had spilled on Gaia when Cronus castrated him? From that blood had sprung the Gigantes, a race of giants of incredible size and power. They had been waiting, growing, becoming stronger. Gaia, the Earth herself, was angry with Zeus and the Olympians. They had imprisoned her Titan children in Tartarus. In her rage, she incited the Gigantes to rise up against the Olympians. This was the Gigantomachy, the War of the Giants. The giants were formidable opponents. They were enormous, each as tall as a mountain. Their legs were serpents or dragons from the waist down. And they had a special quality. They could not be killed by gods alone. A prophecy stated that the giants could only be defeated if a god and a mortal fought together against them. The giants attacked Olympus itself, piling mountain upon mountain to reach the home of the gods. They hurled boulders and flaming trees. The Olympians fought back, but found that their weapons, while they could wound the giants, could not kill them. Zeus had foreseen this through prophecy, and he had a solution. Heracles, his half-mortal son, the greatest hero who ever lived. With Heracles fighting alongside the gods, the giants could be defeated. The battle was epic. Heracles fought alongside Athena against Alcyoneus, the mightiest of the giants. Apollo and Heracles together defeated Ephialtes. Dionysus fought Eurytus. Hephaestus hurled molten metal at Mimas. Poseidon broke off part of the island of Kos and threw it at Polybotes, burying him beneath what became the island of Nisyros. One by one, the giants fell. Each was wounded by a god, and then killed by Heracles or another mortal hero. After a terrible battle, the Olympians were victorious once more, but this was not the end of Gaia's revenge. Still furious that her children had been defeated and imprisoned, Gaia united with Tartarus itself to produce one final weapon against Zeus, Typhon, the most terrible monster ever born. Typhon was monstrous beyond imagination. He was so tall his head touched the stars. From his shoulders grew 100 dragon heads, each breathing fire. His eyes shot flames. His lower body was composed of massive coiled serpents. His roar was a combination of every terrifying sound in nature. The bellow of bulls, the roar of lions, the hissing of serpents, all magnified to world-shaking volume. When Typhon arose, the gods were terrified. Many of them fled to Egypt, transforming themselves into animals to hide. But Zeus stood firm. This was his cosmos to defend, and he would not run. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. Zeus hurled thunderbolt after thunderbolt at the monster. Typhon breathed fire that scorched the earth. Mountains crumbled, the seas boiled, the earth itself cracked open. At first, Typhon seemed to be winning. He managed to grapple with Zeus and cut the sinews from his hands and feet, leaving the king of the gods helpless. Typhon took these sinews and hid them in a cave, with the dragon Delphin to guard them, but Hermes and Aegipan managed to steal back the sinews and restore them to Zeus. Renewed, Zeus pursued Typhon. He struck the monster with thunderbolts, weakening him. Typhon fled, and Zeus chased him to Mount Etna in Sicily. There, Zeus picked up the entire mountain and hurled it at Typhon, burying the monster beneath it. To this day, according to the Greek myth, Typhon remains imprisoned under Mount Etna. When he shifts and struggles, he causes earthquakes. When he breathes, the mountain erupts, spewing fire and ash. With Typhon defeated, the Olympian order was finally secure. Zeus's rule was established beyond any challenge. The age of the gods had truly begun, and they could now turn their attention to the mortals who inhabited the earth below. Now we need to address a question. Where did humans come from in Greek mythology? The answer is more complicated than you might think, because different traditions gave different accounts. The most famous version involves Prometheus, the Titan who had sided with Zeus during the Titanomachy. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, was wise and cunning. He looked at the earth and saw it empty of intelligent life. So he took clay from the earth and water and began to sculpt. He formed creatures in the image of the gods themselves, upright, bipedal, with faces that could look toward the heavens. These were the first humans. Athena, impressed by Prometheus's creation, breathed life into these clay figures, giving them souls. But humans were weak and vulnerable. They had no natural defences, no fur against the cold, no claws or fangs to protect themselves. They would not survive without help. Prometheus loved humanity. He saw in them potential, intelligence, the capacity for greatness. So he became their patron and teacher. He taught them to build shelters, to farm, to use tools. But most importantly, he gave them fire. Fire belonged to the gods. It was divine, and Zeus had forbidden mortals from having it. But Prometheus defied this command. He stole fire from the sacred hearth of Olympus, or in some versions from the forge of Hephaestus, hiding it in a hollow fennel stalk. He brought it to earth and gave it to humanity. With fire, everything changed. Humans could cook their food, making it safer and more nutritious. They could warm themselves against the cold. They could work metal, creating tools and weapons. They could light the darkness. Fire represented knowledge, civilization, progress itself. Zeus was furious. Prometheus had defied him directly, stealing what belonged to the gods and giving it to mortals. The punishment had to be severe, a warning to any who would defy the king of the gods. Zeus had Prometheus seized and brought to the Caucasus Mountains. There, he was chained to a rock with unbreakable bonds forged by Hephaestus. Every day an eagle, some say it was the offspring of Echidna and Typhon, would come and tear open Prometheus's abdomen, eating his liver. Every night, because he was immortal, Prometheus's liver would regenerate. The next day the eagle would come again. This torture was to continue for eternity. But that wasn't Zeus's only punishment. He also decided to punish humanity for accepting Prometheus's gift. Zeus commanded Hephaestus to create something new, something beautiful and terrible. Hephaestus sculpted a woman from clay, the first woman to ever exist. Each of the gods gave her gifts. Aphrodite gave her beauty, Athena taught her crafts, Hermes gave her cunning and a deceitful nature, Apollo taught her music. She was named Pandora, which means all gifts. Zeus gave Pandora to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother. Prometheus had warned Epimetheus never to accept gifts from Zeus, but Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, forgot this warning when he saw Pandora's beauty. He welcomed her into his home and married her. Pandora brought with her a jar, often mistranslated as a box in later traditions. Zeus had told her never to open this jar, knowing that her curiosity would eventually overcome her restraint. And indeed, one day, Pandora could resist no longer. She opened the jar, and from it flew all the evils that would plague humanity. Disease, death, sorrow, poverty, greed, envy, hatred, and countless other afflictions. They spread across the world, and humanity, which had lived in relative innocence, now knew suffering. Pandora slammed the jar shut, but it was too late. Nearly everything had escaped. Only one thing remained trapped inside, Elpis, which is usually translated as hope, but might better be understood as expectation or anticipation. The exact meaning of this has been debated for millennia. Did hope remain trapped because it too is a curse giving false expectations? Or did it remain so that humanity would always have hope, even amid all their suffering? The Greeks left this ambiguous, and perhaps that's the point. This was the Greek explanation for why humans suffer, why life is difficult, why we face disease and death and hardship. It was punishment for accepting fire, for aspiring to knowledge and civilization. But different traditions tell different stories. Hesiod, one of the earliest Greek poets, described 5 ages of humanity, each progressively more fallen than the last. The first was the Golden Age, during the reign of Cronus. Humans lived like gods, without labour or sorrow. When they died, they became benevolent spirits. The second was the Silver Age, during the early reign of Zeus. Humans lived for 100 years as children, but only briefly as adults. They were foolish and refused to worship the gods, so Zeus destroyed them. The third was the Bronze Age. These humans were strong and warlike, born from ash trees. They loved violence and eventually destroyed themselves in constant warfare. The fourth was the Heroic Age, the age of heroes like Heracles, Achilles, and Perseus. These were noble demigods who fought in great wars like Troy. When they died, they went to the Elysian Fields, a paradise where heroes dwell eternally. The fifth was the Iron Age, the current age, Hesiod's own time and ours. This is an age of toil, suffering and moral decline. Humans must work hard for everything. Honour and justice are disappearing. Hesiod prophesied that this age would end when humans are born with grey hair, when children dishonour their parents, when might makes right. Then Zeus would destroy this race too. These different accounts, Prometheus creating humans from clay, the 5 ages of man, coexist in Greek mythology because the Greeks didn't have one authoritative scripture. Different poets and traditions told different versions, and all were considered valid parts of the mythological tradition. In the Greek tradition, there came a time when Zeus looked down at humanity and was disgusted by what he saw. Humans had become wicked, violent, and impious. They no longer honoured the gods. They committed terrible crimes against each other. Zeus decided to wipe out humanity and start over. He would use a great flood to cleanse the earth. He enlisted the help of Poseidon, who stirred up the seas. Zeus sent torrential rains. The rivers overflowed their banks. The seas rose. Slowly but inevitably, the world was submerged. One by one, the cities of men disappeared beneath the waters. Mountains became islands. Then those too were covered. Humanity was drowning. But there were 2 survivors, Deucalion and Pyrrha. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha was the daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora. Prometheus, foreseeing the flood, had warned his son. He told Deucalion to build a great wooden chest, essentially an ark, and to stock it with provisions. When the flood came, Deucalion and Pyrrha climbed into the chest and sealed it. For 9 days and 9 nights, they floated on the flood waters as the world drowned beneath them. Finally, the chest came to rest on Mount Parnassus, one of the few peaks still above water. The rain stopped. The waters began to recede. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerged to find themselves alone in a drowned world. They made their way to the sanctuary of Themis, the titaness of divine law and prophecy. There they prayed and offered sacrifices, begging for guidance. How could they repopulate the earth? They were only 2 people, and they were old. The voice of the oracle spoke to them, "Depart from my temple with veiled heads and loosened robes, and cast behind you the bones of your mother." They were horrified. Cast their mother's bones? That would be sacrilege, a terrible dishonour to the dead. But Deucalion, son of wise Prometheus, understood. Their mother was Gaia, the earth herself. Her bones were the stones. They gathered stones and, walking forward without looking back, threw them over their shoulders. The stones that Deucalion threw became men. The stones that Pyrrha threw became women. Thus humanity was reborn, literally born from the earth itself, explaining why humans are sometimes called the people of the stone. This new generation of humanity was stronger and more pious than the one that had drowned. They honoured the gods and established civilization once more. With humanity established and the gods secure on Olympus, we enter the heroic age, the era of demigods and monsters, of epic quests and tragic falls. This is the age of Greek myth that most people are familiar with. The stories of Perseus, Heracles, Jason, Theseus, Achilles, and Odysseus. These heroes were special. Most were demigods, children born from the union of gods and mortals. They possessed strength, courage, and abilities beyond normal humans, but they were still mortal. They could die, they could suffer, they could fail. Their stories were of triumph and tragedy, glory and doom. The gods took a very active role in this age, constantly meddling in mortal affairs. They fell in love with mortals, they had children with them, they gave gifts and curses, they helped and hindered. The boundary between the divine and the mortal was permeable, and the consequences of this were felt in every hero's story. Let's explore the greatest of these heroes and their legends. Our first great hero is Perseus, son of Zeus and the mortal princess Danae. Danae's father, King Acrisius of Argos, had received a prophecy that he would be killed by his daughter's son. To prevent this, he imprisoned Danae in a bronze chamber underground, where no man could reach her. But Zeus desired Danae. He transformed himself into a shower of golden light and poured through the roof of her prison, impregnating her. When Acrisius discovered that his daughter had given birth to a son, he was terrified of killing them directly, fearing divine retribution. Instead, he sealed Danae and baby Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. The chest floated until it washed ashore on the island of Seriphos. A fisherman named Dictys found them and took them in. Perseus grew up on Seriphos, becoming strong and brave, but King Polydectes of Seriphos desired Danae. Perseus, now a young man, protected his mother from the king's advances. Polydectes decided to get rid of Perseus. He announced he was going to marry another woman and demanded tribute gifts from all his subjects. Perseus, having nothing to give, rashly boasted he would bring the king any gift he desired, even the head of Medusa. Polydectes seized on this. "Bring me the head of Medusa," he said, smiling. It was a death sentence. Medusa was one of the 3 Gorgons, monsters with living venomous snakes for hair. Anyone who looked directly at a Gorgon's face was instantly turned to stone. The Gorgons dwelt in a remote place at the edge of the world, guarded by their sisters, the Grey, 3 ancient women who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them. Perseus seemed doomed, but he was the son of Zeus, and the gods would not let him fail. Athena appeared to him, giving him a polished bronze shield. "Never look directly at Medusa," she instructed. "Use the shield as a mirror." Hermes appeared next, giving Perseus a pair of winged sandals that would allow him to fly, and a special sword that could cut through anything, even the Gorgon's scales. Perseus flew to the far west, where the Grey lived. He approached the 3 sisters and stole their shared eye while they were passing it between them. Blind and helpless, they had no choice but to answer his questions. They told him where to find the Gorgons and how to reach the nymphs who possessed 3 more items he would need: a cap of invisibility, a magical bag called a kibisis, and directions to the Gorgon's lair. Perseus found the nymphs and received these gifts. Now fully equipped, he flew to the end of the world, where the 3 Gorgons slept on a rocky isle. 2 of the Gorgons, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal, but the 3rd, Medusa, could be killed. She had once been a beautiful woman, but had been cursed by Athena and transformed into a monster. Some versions say this was punishment for lying with Poseidon in Athena's temple. Others say Athena transformed her to protect her from further assault. Perseus waited until the Gorgons slept. He flew above them, looking only at Medusa's reflection in his polished shield. Guided by the reflection, he swooped down and with one stroke of his divine sword severed Medusa's head. From Medusa's blood sprang 2 beings, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant born with a golden sword. These were her children by Poseidon, released at her death. Perseus seized Medusa's head, placing it in the kibisis so its deadly gaze was hidden. Stheno and Euryale woke and pursued him, but Perseus used the cap of invisibility to escape, flying away on his winged sandals. On his journey home, Perseus passed over Ethiopia, where he saw a beautiful woman chained to a rock by the sea. This was Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs. Offended, Poseidon had sent a sea monster to ravage the coast. An oracle declared that only by sacrificing Andromeda to the monster could the kingdom be saved. Perseus fell in love with Andromeda immediately. He struck a bargain with her parents. If he saved her, she would become his wife. They agreed. When the sea monster emerged from the depths, Perseus flew to meet it. He drew Medusa's head from the bag and held it before the creature. The monster looked upon the Gorgon's face and was instantly turned to stone, sinking beneath the waves. Perseus freed Andromeda and married her, though not without conflict. She had been betrothed to another man, Phineus, who attacked the wedding. Perseus simply showed him Medusa's head, turning him and his followers to stone. Perseus and Andromeda returned to Seriphos, where they found that King Polydectes had been persecuting Danae, trying to force her to marry him. Perseus stormed into the palace and presented Medusa's head to Polydectes and his court, turning them all to stone. He gave the head to Athena, who placed it on her shield, the Aegis, where it remained as a symbol of protection and terror. He returned the other magical items to the gods and to Hermes. Later, Perseus and Danae returned to Argos to reconcile with Acrisius. But Acrisius, still fearing the prophecy, fled. Perseus participated in funeral games in another city, and while throwing the discus, accidentally struck and killed an old man in the crowd. That man was Acrisius, who had fled there to avoid his fate. The prophecy was fulfilled, as prophecies always are in Greek mythology. Perseus inherited the kingdom, but grief-stricken over the accidental death, traded kingdoms with his relative. He and Andromeda ruled over Mycenae and Tiryns, founding a dynasty. They had many children, and their descendants would include the greatest hero of all, Heracles. Heracles, called Hercules in Roman tradition, is the greatest hero in all of Greek mythology. His strength was unmatched, his courage legendary, but his life was marked by tragedy and suffering as much as by glory. Heracles was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman. Zeus had disguised himself as Alcmene's husband to seduce her, making Heracles a grandson of Perseus. But Hera, Zeus's wife, hated Heracles before he was even born. He was another reminder of her husband's infidelity. Hera tried to prevent Heracles' birth, delaying it so that his cousin Eurystheus would be born first, thus inheriting the kingdom that should have been Heracles' by prophecy. When Heracles was born, Hera sent 2 giant serpents to kill him in his cradle. But the infant Heracles, possessing divine strength, strangled the serpents with his bare hands. Heracles grew to become the strongest man who ever lived. He married Megara, princess of Thebes, and they had several children. For a time, he was happy. But Hera was not finished with him. She struck Heracles with a madness, a temporary insanity. In his delirium, Heracles believed his wife and children were his enemies. He killed them all, slaughtering his own family. When the madness lifted and Heracles realized what he had done, his grief was unbearable. He wanted to die, but his friend Theseus convinced him that suicide would be cowardice. Instead, Heracles sought purification for his terrible crime. The oracle at Delphi told him he must serve his cousin Eurystheus, the king of Tiryns, for 12 years, and perform whatever labours Eurystheus demanded. Only then would he be cleansed of his sin. Eurystheus, cowardly and jealous of Heracles' strength, devised 12 impossible tasks, hoping that one of them would kill the hero. These became known as the 12 labours of Heracles. The first labour, the Nemean lion. The Nemean lion was a massive beast with a hide so thick that no weapon could pierce it. It terrorised the region around Nemea, devouring livestock and people. Heracles tracked the lion to its cave, and when he found his arrows and sword useless against its impenetrable hide, he wrestled the beast with his bare hands, strangling it to death. He skinned the lion using its own claws and wore its hide as armour, with the lion's head as a helmet. This became his iconic appearance. The second labour, the Linnaean Hydra. The Hydra was a serpentine monster with multiple heads, usually depicted as 9, that lived in the swamps of Lerna. The terrifying thing about the Hydra was that whenever one head was cut off, 2 more would grow in its place. Additionally, one of its heads was immortal and could not be killed. Heracles faced this creature with his nephew Iolaus as his charioteer. As Heracles cut off each head, Iolaus seared the neck stumps with burning torches, cauterizing them so new heads couldn't grow. Finally, only the immortal head remained. Heracles severed it and buried it under a massive rock where it remains to this day, still alive but trapped. He dipped his arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood, making them deadly forever after. Even a scratch from these arrows would cause an agonizing death. The third labour, the Ceryneian Hind. The Ceryneian Hind was a female deer sacred to Artemis, with golden antlers and bronze hooves. It could outrun any arrow. Heracles had to capture it alive without harming it, which made the task incredibly difficult. He pursued the hind for an entire year, finally cornering it and carefully capturing it without injury. When Artemis confronted him for taking her sacred animal, Heracles explained about his labours, and she allowed him to take it to Eurystheus, as long as he released it afterward. The fourth labour, the Erymanthian boar. Heracles had to capture alive a massive boar that lived on Mount Erymanthus. He chased the boar into deep snow, where it became exhausted. He then netted it and brought it back to Eurystheus. The king was so terrified when he saw the boar that he hid in a large bronze jar, begging Heracles to take the creature away. The fifth labour, the Augean stables. King. Augeas owned vast herds of cattle, and their stables had not been cleaned in 30 years. The filth was enormous, an impossible task to clean. Heracles made a deal with Augeas. He would clean the stables in a single day, in exchange for 1/10 of the cattle. Augeas agreed, thinking it impossible, but Heracles cleverly diverted 2 rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, to flow through the stables, washing away all the filth in a single day. When Augeas refused to pay, Heracles later returned and killed him, conquering his kingdom. The sixth labour, the Stymphalian birds. The Stymphalian birds were man-eating birds with bronze beaks, sharp metallic feathers that they could launch like arrows, and poisonous droppings. They flocked in huge numbers around Lake Stymphalia. Athena gave Heracles a rattle made by Hephaestus, which he used to startle the birds into flight. As they rose, he shot them down with his arrows. The seventh labour, the Cretan bull king. Minos of Crete had received a magnificent bull from Poseidon with the understanding he would sacrifice it. But Minos kept the bull, angering the god. Poseidon made the bull go mad, and it rampaged across Crete, breathing fire and causing destruction. Heracles wrestled the bull into submission and brought it back to Eurystheus. It was later released and wandered to Marathon, where it became known as the Marathonian bull and was eventually killed by Theseus. The eighth labour, the mares of Diomedes. King Diomedes of Thrace owned 4 man-eating horses. Heracles captured them, but Diomedes pursued him with his army. In the battle, Heracles defeated Diomedes and fed the king to his own horses, which calmed them. He then brought them back to Eurystheus. Later, these horses were released and eventually made their way to Mount Olympus, where they were torn apart by wild animals. The ninth labour, the belt of Hippolyta. Hippolyta was queen of the Amazons, a nation of warrior women, and she possessed a golden belt given to her by Ares, god of war. Eurystheus wanted this belt for his daughter. When Heracles arrived in the land of the Amazons, Hippolyta was so impressed by him that she agreed to give him the belt freely. But Hera, disguised as an Amazon, spread a rumour that Heracles planned to abduct the queen. The Amazons attacked, and in the battle that followed, Hippolyta was killed. Heracles took the belt from her body and returned with it, the 10th labour, the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a 3-bodied giant who lived on the island of Erythea, far to the west, almost at the edge of the world. He owned a herd of magnificent red cattle, guarded by the giant shepherd Eurytion and the 2-headed dog Orthrus, brother of Kerberos. To reach the island, Heracles borrowed the golden cup of Helios, which the sun god used to sail across the ocean every night. Heracles killed Orthrus, Eurytion, and finally Geryon himself with his poisoned arrows. He herded the cattle into Helios's cup and sailed back, then drove the cattle overland all the way to Greece, having many adventures along the way. The 11th labour, the apples of the Hesperides. The Hesperides were nymphs who tended a garden at the western edge of the world, where there grew a tree bearing golden apples. These apples granted immortality. The tree was guarded by Ladon, a 100-headed dragon. The apples belonged to Hera, given to her as a wedding gift. Heracles didn't know where to find the garden, so he first had to capture Nereus, the old man of the sea, who could not lie, and force him to reveal the location. Then Heracles encountered the Titan Atlas, who was condemned to hold up the sky for eternity as punishment for siding with the Titans in the Titanomachy. Heracles made a deal. Atlas should retrieve the apples since the Hesperides were his daughters, and Heracles would hold the sky in his place. Atlas agreed, glad for the respite. He went and retrieved the apples, but when he returned, he refused to take back the burden of the sky, offering to deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself. Heracles pretended to agree, but asked Atlas to hold the sky for just a moment, while he adjusted his cloak for padding. As soon as Atlas took back the weight, Heracles grabbed the apples and left, leaving Atlas to his eternal punishment. The 12th labour, capturing Cerberus. The final and most dangerous labour was to descend into the underworld and capture Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades, preventing the dead from escaping. No mortal had ever entered the underworld and returned alive. Heracles was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries to prepare for this journey. He descended through a cave at Cape Taenarum. When he reached the underworld, he asked Hades for permission to take Cerberus. Hades agreed on the condition that Heracles overpower the beast without using weapons. Heracles found Cerberus at the gates and wrestled the monster into submission with his bare hands, despite the dog's 3 heads and serpentine tail. He brought Cerberus to the surface, showed him to Eurystheus, who again hid in his bronze jar in terror, and then returned the dog to the underworld. With the completion of the 12 labours, Heracles was purified of his crime and free. But his story didn't end there. He had many more adventures, married again, and ultimately met a tragic end when his wife, tricked by the centaur Nessus, gave him a poisoned robe thinking it was a love charm. The poison caused such agony that Heracles built his own funeral pyre and had himself burned alive. But Heracles did not die as mortals do. As the flames consumed his mortal body, his divine essence, inherited from Zeus, ascended to Olympus. He became a full god, was reconciled with Hera, and married Hebe, goddess of youth. He was granted immortality and took his place among the Olympians as a reward for his heroic life. Theseus was the great hero of Athens, son of King Aegeus of Athens, though some versions say Poseidon was his true father. Like Heracles, Theseus had numerous adventures, but he is most famous for his encounter with the Minotaur. The story begins years earlier with King Minos of Crete. When Minos was competing for the throne, he prayed to Poseidon to send a sign of divine favour. Poseidon sent a magnificent white bull from the sea, with the understanding that Minos would sacrifice it. But the bull was so beautiful that Minos kept it, sacrificing a lesser animal instead. Poseidon was enraged by this broken promise. As punishment, he caused Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, to fall in love with the bull. Desperate to fulfill this unnatural desire, Pasiphae had the master craftsman Daedalus build a hollow wooden cow covered in real cowhide. She climbed inside, and the bull, fooled by the disguise, mated with it. From this union, Pasiphae gave birth to the Minotaur, a creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man. The Minotaur was fierce and ate human flesh. Ashamed and horrified, Minos had Daedalus construct an elaborate labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos, a maze so complex that no one who entered could ever find their way out. The Minotaur was imprisoned in the centre of this labyrinth. Meanwhile, Athens had gone to war with Crete and lost. As tribute, Minos demanded that every 9 years, Athens must send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete. These 14 victims would be sent into the labyrinth to be devoured by the Minotaur. When Theseus came of age, it was time for Athens to send the third tribute. Theseus volunteered to be one of the 14, determined to kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. His father, Aegeus, was terrified, but proud. He made Theseus promise that if he survived, he would change the ship's black sails to white on the return journey, so Aegeus would know from a distance that his son lived. When the Athenian victims arrived in Crete, they were brought before King Minos. There, Minos' daughter, Princess Ariadne, saw Theseus and immediately fell in love with him. She went to Daedalus and begged him to tell her how to escape the labyrinth. Daedalus gave her a ball of thread. Ariadne went to Theseus and offered him the thread, asking in return that he take her back to Athens and marry her. Theseus agreed. When Theseus entered the labyrinth, he tied one end of the thread to the entrance and unspooled it as he walked deeper and deeper into the maze. He wandered through countless passages until finally, in the centre, he encountered the Minotaur. The beast charged, but Theseus was ready. Different versions tell the battle differently. Some say he used a sword given by Ariadne, others that he fought with his bare hands. But all versions agree. Theseus killed the Minotaur. He then followed Ariadne's thread back through the labyrinth, escaping with all 13 other Athenian victims. They fled to the ship, taking Ariadne with them, and sailed away while the Cretans slept. On the journey home, they stopped at the island of Naxos. What happened next is disputed. Some versions say Theseus cruelly abandoned Ariadne there while she slept, sailing away without her. Others say the god Dionysus appeared and claimed Ariadne as his bride, commanding Theseus to leave her. Either way, Ariadne woke alone on Naxos and was soon found by Dionysus, who fell in love with her and married her, making her immortal. Her crown was placed in the sky as a constellation. Theseus sailed on toward Athens, but in his haste and excitement, or perhaps in his grief over abandoning Ariadne, he forgot to change the ship's sails from black to white. King Aegeus stood on a cliff every day, watching the sea for his son's return. When he saw the ship approaching with black sails, he believed Theseus had been killed. In his grief, Aegeus threw himself from the cliff into the sea below. That sea has been called the Aegean ever since, named for the king who died there. Theseus returned to find himself king of Athens. He unified the region of Attica under Athenian rule and became one of Athens' greatest and most beloved kings. He had many more adventures, including joining the Argonauts, fighting the Amazons, and ascending to the underworld to try to abduct Persephone, an adventure that ended badly, and required Heracles to rescue him. The quest for the Golden Fleece is one of the greatest adventure stories in Greek mythology, bringing together many heroes in a single expedition. Jason was the son of Aeson, rightful king of Iolcus in Thessaly. But Aeson's half-brother Peleus had usurped the throne. To protect the infant Jason, Aeson sent him away to be raised by Chiron, the wise centaur who trained many heroes. When Jason grew to manhood, he returned to Iolcus to claim his rightful throne. On his journey, he helped an old woman cross a river, losing one sandal in the mud. The old woman was actually Hera in disguise, testing him, and from that moment she became his patron. Jason arrived at Peleus' court wearing only one sandal. This terrified Peleus because an oracle had warned him to beware of a man with one sandal. When Jason demanded the throne, Peleus agreed to give it up, but only if Jason first completed what seemed an impossible task: travel to Colchis at the edge of the world and retrieve the Golden Fleece. The Golden Fleece came from a flying ram sent by Zeus to rescue two children, Phrixus and Helle, from being sacrificed. Helle fell off during the flight and drowned in what became the Hellespont, but Phrixus reached Colchis safely. There he sacrificed the ram in gratitude to Zeus and gave its fleece to King Aeetes, who hung it in a sacred grove guarded by a sleepless dragon. Jason agreed to attempt the quest. He commissioned the building of a great ship, the Argo, which was said to be the first ship capable of sailing the open sea. He sent out a call for heroes to join him, and they came, the greatest warriors, adventurers, and demigods of the age. The crew of the Argo, known as the Argonauts, included Heracles, the strongest man alive, Orpheus, the greatest musician whose songs could charm even stones, Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, Atalanta, the only woman among them, a huntress as skilled as Artemis herself, Peleus, who would become the father of Achilles, Telamon, who would father Ajax, Theseus, king of Athens, and dozens of others. The Argonauts faced countless adventures on their journey east. They stopped at Lemnos, an island inhabited only by women who had killed their husbands. They passed through the Hellespont and encountered the Harpies tormenting the blind prophet Phineus. Two of the Argonauts, the winged sons of the North Wind, chased the Harpies away. In gratitude, Phineus told them how to navigate the clashing rocks, the Symplegades, massive rocks that smashed together, crushing any ship that tried to pass between them. He advised them to send a dove through first. If it survived, they should follow immediately. They did so, and the Argo made it through with only minor damage to its stern. After that, the Symplegades stopped clashing, remaining fixed forever. When they finally reached Colchis, Jason presented himself to King Aeetes and asked for the Golden Fleece. Aeetes had no intention of giving it up, but he didn't want to simply refuse and anger the gods, so he set Jason seemingly impossible tasks. He must yoke 2 fire-breathing bronze bulls, plough a field with them, and sow dragons' teeth in the furrows. From these teeth would spring an army of warriors, and Jason would have to defeat them all. Only then would Aeetes give him the fleece. This should have been Jason's death sentence. But Hera intervened, asking Aphrodite to help. Aphrodite sent her son Eros to shoot King Aeetes' daughter, Medea, with an arrow of love. Medea was a priestess of Hecate and a powerful sorceress. When she saw Jason, she fell desperately, madly in love with him. That night, she went to him secretly and offered her help, asking only that he take her with him and marry her. Jason swore an oath by all the gods. Medea gave Jason a magic ointment that would protect him from the bull's fire. She told him that when the warriors sprang from the dragon's teeth, he should throw a stone among them. The warriors would turn on each other, fighting until all were dead. Everything happened as Medea predicted. Jason yoked the bulls, ploughed the field, sowed the teeth, and when the warriors arose, he threw a stone. They slaughtered each other while Jason watched. But Aeetes still refused to give up the fleece, planning instead to burn the Argo and kill all the Argonauts. Medea warned Jason. That night, she led him to the sacred grove where the Golden Fleece hung, guarded by the sleepless dragon. She sang to the dragon, using magic to put it to sleep, and Jason seized the fleece. They fled to the Argo and sailed away immediately, taking Medea's younger brother Absyrtus as hostage. When Aeetes pursued them, Medea did something monstrous. She killed her own brother, cut his body into pieces and scattered them in the sea. Aeetes had to stop to gather his son's remains for proper burial, allowing the Argo to escape. The journey home was long and difficult. They encountered more challenges, including having to be cleansed of the murder of Absyrtus by Circe, Medea's aunt. They sailed past the sirens, women whose songs lured sailors to their doom, but Orpheus played his lyre so beautifully that it drowned out their singing. They passed between Scylla, a six-headed monster, and Charybdis, a massive whirlpool, losing several crew members. Finally, they returned to Iolcus with the Golden Fleece. But Peleus refused to give up the throne. Medea took revenge. She tricked Peleus's daughters into believing they could restore their father's youth by cutting him up and boiling him in a cauldron with magic herbs. She demonstrated by doing this to an old ram, which emerged as a lamb. When the daughters did this to Peleus, he simply died, cut apart by his own children. Jason and Medea were exiled from Iolcus. They went to Corinth, where they lived for some years and had children. But eventually Jason's ambition overcame his honour. The king of Corinth offered Jason his daughter's hand in marriage, a chance to become king. Jason agreed, abandoning Medea despite his oaths. Medea's revenge was terrible. She sent Jason's new bride a beautiful poisoned robe that burst into flames when she put it on, killing both her and her father who tried to save her. Then, in the most horrific act imaginable, Medea murdered her own children by Jason, robbing him of his heirs and legacy. Jason lived the rest of his life in misery. Years later, he returned to look at the Argo, which had been hauled ashore and dedicated to Poseidon. As he sat beneath it, remembering his glory days, a piece of the rotting ship broke off and fell on him, killing him. The gods placed the Argo in the sky as a constellation, but removed its stern, the part that had been damaged by the clashing rocks. So only part of the ship is visible in the heavens. The Trojan War is the most famous event in Greek mythology, immortalized by Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. But the war's origins go back decades before the first blow was struck. It all began at a wedding. The sea nymph Thetis was being married to the mortal Peleus. All the gods and goddesses were invited, all except one. Eris, goddess of discord and strife, was deliberately excluded because she always caused trouble. Furious at being snubbed, Eris decided to cause chaos anyway. She took a golden apple and inscribed it with the words, "For the fairest." Then she tossed it into the middle of the wedding feast and left. 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple: Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of beauty. Each believed herself to be the fairest. The gods, wisely, refused to judge between them. Zeus decided the matter should be settled by a mortal. He chose Paris, a prince of Troy who was living as a shepherd on Mount Ida. Paris was handsome and had a reputation for fairness in judgment. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris, each trying to bribe him. Hera offered him power. She would make him king of all Asia. Athena offered wisdom and glory in war. She would make him the greatest warrior who ever lived. Aphrodite offered him love. She would give him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris chose Aphrodite's offer, giving her the golden apple. This single decision would lead to the deaths of countless heroes and the destruction of Troy. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda. She had been courted by every prince in Greece. Her mortal father Tyndareus, fearing that choosing one suitor would make enemies of all the others, made every suitor swear an oath. They would accept Helen's choice, and, if anyone ever tried to steal her away, all of them would unite to bring her back. Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, and they married. They had a daughter together and seemed happy. But Aphrodite had promised Helen to Paris. When Paris travelled to Sparta on a diplomatic mission, Aphrodite caused Helen to fall in love with him. Whether Helen went willingly or was abducted by force varies in different versions, but the result was the same. Paris and Helen fled together to Troy. Menelaus was enraged. He called upon all of Helen's former suitors to honour their oath. They assembled the greatest army Greece had ever seen. There was Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and High King of Mycenae, who became commander-in-chief. There was Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca. Ajax, massive and strong, second only to Achilles in battle prowess. Diomedes, the fierce warrior. Nestor, the old and wise king of Pylos, and many others. But the greatest warrior was missing: Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis. Achilles' mother, the sea nymph Thetis, knew a prophecy. If Achilles went to Troy, he would die there, though he would win eternal glory. If he stayed home, he would live a long life but be forgotten. To protect him, Thetis hid Achilles among the daughters of King Lycomedes, disguising him as a girl. But the Greeks had their own prophecy. They could not take Troy without Achilles. Odysseus figured out where Achilles was hiding. He went to Lycomedes' palace disguised as a merchant, offering jewellery and fine cloth to the king's daughters, but he also brought weapons. While the real girls admired the jewellery, Achilles instinctively reached for the sword and spear. His disguise was broken. Odysseus convinced Achilles to join the war. Achilles knew he was choosing glory over life, but he chose it anyway. He brought with him the Myrmidons, his loyal warriors, and his closest friend Patroclus. There was one more problem. The fleet couldn't sail. They were stuck at Aulis because there was no wind. The prophet Calchas revealed why. Agamemnon had offended the goddess Artemis by boasting he was a better hunter. She demanded a sacrifice, Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon faced a terrible choice: give up the war or kill his own child. Eventually he decided to sacrifice Iphigenia. He sent for her under the pretense that she would marry Achilles. When she arrived, he led her to the altar. Some versions say he went through with the sacrifice. Others say that at the last moment, Artemis took pity, replaced Iphigenia with a deer, and spirited the girl away to be her priestess. Either way, the winds came and the fleet sailed for Troy. The siege of Troy would last 10 years. The war dragged on for 9 years without either side gaining a decisive advantage. Troy's walls were too strong to breach, but the Trojans couldn't defeat the Greek army in open battle. The Greeks controlled the coastline but couldn't take the city. Homer's Iliad takes place in the 10th year of the war, covering only a few weeks of action. But those weeks would decide everything. The poem begins with a plague ravaging the Greek camp. Achilles called an assembly to discover the cause. The prophet Calchas revealed that Apollo was angry because Agamemnon had dishonoured his priest by refusing to return the priest's daughter, Chryseis, whom Agamemnon had taken as a war prize. Reluctantly, Agamemnon agreed to return Chryseis, but he was furious at being forced to give up his prize. In compensation, he took Achilles' war prize, a woman named Briseis, asserting his authority as supreme commander. Achilles was enraged. He had won Briseis fairly in battle, and Agamemnon was taking her simply to soothe his own wounded pride. The insult was unbearable. Achilles declared he would fight no more. He withdrew to his tent with the Myrmidons, refusing to participate in the war. Achilles' mother Thetis went to Zeus and asked him to honour her son by making the Trojans successful, while Achilles was absent, so the Greeks would realise how much they needed him. Zeus agreed, though he knew this would anger his wife Hera, who supported the Greeks. With Achilles withdrawn, the Trojans pushed forward. Led by their greatest warrior, Hector, Prince of Troy, they drove the Greeks back toward their ships. Days of brutal combat followed. Heroes on both sides performed great deeds. There was a failed duel between Paris and Menelaus, where Paris was saved by Aphrodite just as Menelaus was about to kill him. Diomedes, inspired by Athena, went on a rampage, wounding even gods. He stabbed Aphrodite when she tried to save her son Aeneas, and he wounded Ares himself. But slowly, the Greeks were losing. Hector was unstoppable, killing hero after hero. The Greeks begged Achilles to return. Agamemnon even offered to give back Briseis along with treasure and honours. But Achilles refused. His pride and anger wouldn't let him yield. As the battle grew more desperate, Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend, begged Achilles to let him help. If Achilles wouldn't fight, at least let Patroclus wear Achilles' armour. The Trojans would see the armour and think Achilles had returned, and it might turn the tide. Achilles reluctantly agreed, but warned Patroclus to only defend the ships, not to pursue the Trojans too far. Patroclus donned Achilles' armour and led the Myrmidons into battle. The plan worked. The Trojans fell back, thinking Achilles had returned. But Patroclus, caught up in battle fury, ignored Achilles' warning and pursued the Trojans all the way to Troy's walls. There, Hector confronted him. With Apollo's help clouding Patroclus' senses, Hector struck him down, killing him and stripping Achilles' armour from his body. When Achilles learned that Patroclus was dead, his grief was boundless. He rolled in the dirt, tearing at his hair, screaming his anguish to the heavens. All his rage at Agamemnon meant nothing. Only vengeance mattered now, but his armour was lost. Thetis went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, and begged him to forge new armour for her son. Hephaestus created the most magnificent armour ever made, including a shield so detailed it depicted the entire cosmos, the earth, sea, and sky, cities at peace and war, farmers harvesting, dancers celebrating, all of human life captured in bronze and gold and silver. Armed with this divine equipment, Achilles returned to battle. He was like a force of nature, unstoppable, terrifying. He carved through the Trojan army like a scythe through wheat. He killed so many men in the river Scamander that the river god itself rose up and attacked him, only to be driven back by other gods. Finally, Achilles came face to face with Hector before Troy's walls. Hector tried to run, circling the walls 3 times with Achilles in pursuit. Zeus weighed their fates on his golden scales, and Hector's side sank down, sealing his doom. Athena tricked Hector into stopping and facing Achilles. They fought, and Achilles was the superior warrior. He drove his spear through Hector's throat. As Hector lay dying, he begged Achilles to return his body to his father for proper burial. Achilles refused. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it around Troy's walls, while Hector's parents and wife watched in horror from above. For days, Achilles dragged Hector's body around Patroclus' funeral barrow, dishonouring the corpse. The gods were disturbed by this excessive cruelty. Then, in the night, an old man came to Achilles' tent. It was King Priam of Troy, Hector's father, guided there by Hermes. Priam knelt before the man who had killed his son and begged for his body back. He kissed Achilles' hands, the hands that had killed so many of his children. Achilles looked at Priam and saw his own father, Peleus, whom he would never see again. Both were fathers who had lost their sons to this terrible war. Achilles' rage broke. He wept with Priam and then agreed to return Hector's body. They declared a temporary truce so Troy could hold Hector's funeral. The Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, not with the fall of Troy. But we know from other sources what happened next. After Hector's death, Troy received reinforcements. The Amazons came, led by their queen Penthesilea. She was a fierce warrior, and for a time she held the Greeks at bay. But Achilles killed her in single combat. As she lay dying, their eyes met, and Achilles realized she was beautiful and noble. Too late, he felt something like love for her, mixing with his grief. Then came Memnon, king of Ethiopia, son of Eos, the dawn goddess. He was almost Achilles' equal, wearing armour also forged by Hephaestus. They fought, and Achilles killed him too. Eos wept for her son, and her tears became the morning dew. But Achilles' own death was approaching. Paris, guided by Apollo, shot an arrow at Achilles. The arrow struck him in his heel, his only vulnerable spot. When Achilles was a baby, his mother Thetis had dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, but she held him by his heel, leaving that spot unprotected. The greatest warrior in the world died from an arrow shot by Paris, the least worthy of all the combatants. Achilles' body was fought over by Ajax and Odysseus, who managed to recover it. His funeral was elaborate, and his ashes were mixed with those of Patroclus so they would be together forever. His divine armour was to be awarded to the worthiest warrior. Both Ajax and Odysseus claimed it. The decision was put to a vote, and Odysseus won through clever speech. Ajax, humiliated and enraged, went mad. In his madness he slaughtered a flock of sheep, thinking they were his enemies. When he regained his senses and realized what he'd done, his shame was so great that he fell on his own sword. The war seemed endless. The prophet Calchas revealed that Troy could never be taken by force. They needed the bow and arrows of Heracles, which had been given to Philoctetes. But Philoctetes had been abandoned on an island years earlier because of a festering wound that smelled terrible. Odysseus and others had to retrieve him, promising to heal his wound, which they did. With Heracles' arrows, Philoctetes killed Paris, but Troy still didn't fall. Another prophecy revealed that they needed to steal the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena that protected Troy. Odysseus and Diomedes snuck into Troy at night and stole it. Finally, Odysseus devised the plan that would end the war, the Trojan horse. The Greeks built an enormous wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to hold a group of warriors. They hid their best fighters inside, Odysseus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, and others. Then the Greek army burned their camp and sailed away, as if giving up the siege. They left behind only the horse and one man, Sinon, who pretended to be a deserter. The Trojans found the horse and Sinon. He told them a convincing lie. The horse was an offering to Athena, built large so the Trojans couldn't bring it into the city. If they did bring it in, Troy would be blessed. If they destroyed it, they would be cursed. Some Trojans were suspicious. Cassandra, a princess with the gift of prophecy, cursed so no one would believe her, warned them it was a trick. The priest Lokoon warned, "I fear Greeks even bearing gifts," and threw his spear at the horse. But then 2 giant sea serpents emerged from the sea and killed Laocoon and his sons, sent by Athena or Poseidon to silence him. The Trojans, taking this as a sign that the gods wanted them to accept the horse, dragged it through their gates. They celebrated, believing the war was finally over. They feasted and drank. That night, when Troy slept, the Greeks inside the horse opened the door and climbed out. Sinon lit a signal fire, and the Greek fleet, which had only sailed to a nearby island, returned. The warriors opened Troy's gates from inside. The Greek army poured into the sleeping city. What followed was a massacre. The Trojans, caught off guard, fought desperately but hopelessly. King Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus in his own palace by Neoptolemus. Hector's infant son Astyanax was thrown from the walls to ensure no heir of Troy would survive to seek revenge. The women of Troy were taken as slaves. Hector's wife Andromache was given to Neoptolemus. Cassandra was claimed by Agamemnon. Hecuba, the old queen, was enslaved. The city was burned, the great towers fell. Troy, which had stood for so long, was reduced to ash and ruin. Only a few Trojans escaped. Chief among them was Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, who carried his aged father Anchises on his back while leading his son by the hand. According to Roman legend, Aeneas and his followers eventually reached Italy and became the ancestors of the Romans. The war was over. But for the Greek heroes, the journey home would be just as difficult and dangerous as the war itself. Of all the Greeks who left Troy, none had a more difficult journey home than Odysseus. His 10-year voyage, recounted in Homer's Odyssey, is one of the greatest adventure stories ever told. Odysseus left Troy with 12 ships and their crews. He would return home alone, having lost everything. First, they raided the Cicones and were driven away with losses. Then a storm blew them off course to the land of the Lotus Eaters, where the inhabitants ate a plant that made them forget their homes and want to stay forever. Odysseus had to drag some of his men back to the ships by force. Next, they came to the island of the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants who lived in caves and kept flocks of sheep. Odysseus took 12 men to explore and entered the cave of Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. When Polyphemus returned, he trapped them inside by blocking the entrance with a boulder too large for them to move. The Cyclops began eating Odysseus's men, 2 at a time. Odysseus devised a plan. He offered Polyphemus wine, getting the Cyclops drunk. When Polyphemus asked his name, Odysseus said, "My name is Nobody." After the Cyclops fell into a drunken sleep, Odysseus and his men heated a massive wooden stake in the fire and drove it into Polyphemus's single eye, blinding him. Polyphemus screamed, and the other Cyclops came to his cave asking what was wrong. "Nobody is killing me!" Polyphemus shouted, so they left, thinking he was mad. In the morning, Polyphemus opened the cave to let his sheep out, feeling each one to make sure no men escaped. But Odysseus had tied his men under the sheep's bellies. They escaped and fled to their ships. As they sailed away, Odysseus couldn't resist shouting back his real name, boasting of his victory. This was a fatal mistake. Polyphemus prayed to his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus, asking that he lose all his men and return home after many years of suffering, finding trouble in his house. Poseidon heard and granted the prayer. After more adventures, they reached the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus gave Odysseus a bag containing all the winds except the one that would blow them home. For 9 days they sailed, and Ithaca was in sight. But while Odysseus slept, his men opened the bag, thinking it contained treasure. All the winds escaped, blowing them back to Aeolus's island. Aeolus refused to help them again, saying they were clearly cursed by the gods. They came to the land of the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals who destroyed 11 of the 12 ships. Only Odysseus's own ship escaped. They reached Aiaia, the island of the sorceress Circe. She turned Odysseus's scouts into pigs with her magic. Hermes appeared to Odysseus and gave him a magical herb called moly that would protect him from Circe's spells. Odysseus confronted Circe, forcing her to change his men back. They stayed with her for a year. Circe told Odysseus he must journey to the underworld to consult the dead prophet Tiresias about how to get home. In the land of the dead, Odysseus saw many ghosts. His mother, who had died of grief waiting for him. Achilles, who said he would rather be a living slave than a dead king. Agamemnon, who had been murdered by his wife Clytemnestra when he returned home. Ajax, who still refused to speak to Odysseus over the armour of Achilles. Tiresias warned Odysseus not to harm the cattle of the sun god Helios when he reached that island, or he would lose all his men and return home alone. They sailed past the sirens, whose song lured sailors to their deaths. Odysseus had his men plug their ears with wax, but he wanted to hear the song, so he had himself tied to the mast. The sirens sang of knowledge and glory, and Odysseus strained against his bonds, begging to be released, but his men, who couldn't hear him, kept sailing. They passed between Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla had 6 heads on long necks, and she snatched 6 of Odysseus's men, devouring them while they screamed. It was the price of passage. Finally they reached Thrinacia, the island where Helios's sacred cattle grazed. Odysseus warned his men not to touch the cattle, but they were stuck on the island for a month by bad weather, and their supplies ran out. While Odysseus was inland praying, his men, desperate and starving, killed and ate some of the cattle. Helios was enraged. He demanded Zeus punish them, or he would take the sun down into the underworld, leaving the world in darkness. When they set sail again, Zeus struck the ship with a thunderbolt. All of Odysseus's men drowned. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to wreckage. He drifted for 9 days until he washed ashore on Ogygia, the island of the nymph Calypso. She fell in love with him and kept him there for 7 years, offering him immortality if he would stay and be her husband. But Odysseus refused. He wanted to go home to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. Finally, at Athena's urging, Zeus ordered Calypso to release Odysseus. She helped him build a raft and he set sail once more, but Poseidon, still angry, sent a storm that destroyed the raft. Odysseus would have drowned, but a sea nymph gave him her veil, which kept him afloat. He swam for 2 days and finally reached the land of the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians welcomed him, and after he told them his story, they gave him a ship that brought him, at last, to Ithaca. But 20 years had passed, 10 at Troy, 10 trying to get home. In his palace, 108 suitors had taken over, trying to force Penelope to choose one of them to marry. They were eating Odysseus's food, drinking his wine, and abusing his household. Everyone believed Odysseus was dead. Penelope had held them off with a trick. She said she would choose a suitor when she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father. But each night, she secretly unravelled what she had woven during the day, so the work was never finished. Odysseus, disguised as a beggar with Athena's help, entered his own house. Only his old dog Argos recognised him. The dog, which had waited 20 years, wagged its tail once and then died. Odysseus revealed himself to his son Telemachus, and together they planned revenge. Penelope, not knowing Odysseus had returned, announced a contest. She would marry whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. The suitors all tried and failed. They couldn't even bend the bow. Then the disguised Odysseus asked to try. The suitors mocked him, but Penelope allowed it. Odysseus strung the bow effortlessly and shot through all 12 axes. Then he threw off his disguise, and with Telemachus and 2 loyal servants, he slaughtered all 108 suitors. Blood soaked the great hall. Penelope was brought to him, but she was cautious. She had been tricked before. She tested him by mentioning moving their bed. Odysseus became angry, explaining that he had built their bed around a living olive tree, and it couldn't be moved. Only the real Odysseus would know this. Penelope threw herself into his arms. At last, after 20 years of war and wandering, Odysseus was home. The Trojan War marked the end of the heroic age. Most of the great heroes died at Troy or in their journeys home. Their children never matched their father's glory. The age of demigods walking the earth was ending. This is the entire story of Greek mythology, from chaos to the twilight of heroes. It's a cosmology that explains how the world came to be, how the gods established their rule, and how humanity came to know both divine favour and suffering. Greek mythology wasn't just entertainment for the ancient Greeks, it was their way of understanding the universe. Why do we suffer? Pandora's jar. Why do we have fire and civilization? Prometheus's gift and punishment. Why must we die? Because we are not gods. Why do bad things happen to good people? The whims of the gods, fate, the consequences of hubris. These stories have endured for thousands of years because they speak to fundamental human experiences: love, loss, ambition, jealousy, courage, betrayal, the relationship between mortality and meaning. The gods are immortal, but their lives are often empty of true stakes. The heroes are mortal, and that mortality gives their actions weight and meaning. From the primordial chaos to the fall of Troy, from titans to Olympians to heroes and back to mortal struggles, this is Greek mythology in its entirety. These stories have influenced Western literature, art and thought for millennia, and they continue to resonate because they capture something essential about the human condition. The myths end here, but their influence never will. They are part of our cultural heritage, our shared story, our attempt to understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. This is Greek mythology, the entire story from beginning to end.